One small mistake, a hidden fear, a secret so deep that it took one life and gave another a new beginning. In St Mary Mead, nothing was as it seemed, a truth lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to surface. When a woman's fear led her to stain her hands with blood, would the truth ever come to light? Are you ready to hear the story? Because this is one twisted tale that will stay with you, haunting your mind long after it ends. The morning sunlight seeped through the lace curtains of Danemy with a ghostly softness, casting intricate patterns across the polished wooden floor, dancing like silent spectres, as Miss Eliza Marlowe sat nestled in her deep velvet armchair. A spot she had claimed for years, worn just enough to cradle her precisely. In her lap rested a modest tapestry in progress, needle gliding in and out, as if her fingers had memory independent of thought, stitching roses into a backdrop of twisting brambles. Outside, the garden swayed under the weight of late spring's bloom, lavender heavy with perfume, sweet peas reaching for the sun, and deep crimson roses nodding like secrets waiting to be spoken. The calm was a veneer, too smooth to trust. Clara Finch, her quiet but sharp-eyed maid, entered with a silver tray, the clink of porcelain unnaturally loud in the room's stillness. "Thank you, Clara," Eliza said with a faint smile, her voice low and deliberate. "The air feels strange today, warm but not welcoming." Clara hesitated, then said, "They're saying odd things in the shops, people talking like something's coming, though no one will say what." Eliza raised an eyebrow, sipping her tea as her eyes remained fixed beyond the window's lace, not at the flowers, but the spaces between. Their conversation drifted, outwardly mundane, touching on the village fete and its familiar rivalries. Yet below the surface, their words wove around unspoken currents, the sighting of a shadowy figure slipping from the locked post office after dark. The greengrocer's wife seen wiping tears from her cheek behind stacked crates, while her husband's voice, sharp and cold, carried through the alley. The vicar's sudden absences and his nervous glances when asked simple questions. These were not just idle tales. Eliza, who had spent a lifetime reading the hearts of people like books with torn covers, knew better than most. True danger never declared itself. It bled in through the cracks of routine. By week's end, the first power cut came like a breath held too long, and then released. One moment the village glowed in its quiet domesticity, and the next, it fell into unnatural silence. The pattern repeated over days, darkness descending just after sundown, cutting conversations in mid-sentence, plunging kitchens and parlors into flickering confusion. At the haberdashery, rumors swirled faster than ribbon rolls. Some blamed the council's electrical upgrades, others hinted at sabotage, and one old woman, shaking as she bought needles, muttered about something inhuman, something that didn't belong. Clara brought home fragments of these stories, and Eliza listened, not dismissing them, but cataloguing each with the precision of someone who understood that truth often wore absurdity like a mask. She remembered the war, the way shadows had once hidden more than bombs, the way blackouts had uncovered ugliness in even the gentlest people. "Candlelight reveals more than electricity ever could," she once murmured, striking a match with careful grace. Constable Hawthorne, too eager and too green, made rounds he didn't know how to interpret. He knocked on doors, asked questions that trembled at the edges of relevance, and walked away more burdened than before. Thornbridge was shifting, slowly, like earth before a sinkhole. Then came the fifth night. The village bell struck 9, and the light died with it. A heartbeat later, the entire village dissolved into shadow, not chaotic, but deliberate, like a curtain lowering on a stage. The stillness that followed was not empty. It was dense, heavy with the sense that something was watching. Eliza stood calmly, retrieving the brass candlestick from the hall table, lighting it with a practiced hand. The flame sputtered, then held steady, casting trembling shadows against the wallpaper. Across the road, Lavinia Blackwood's home loomed, a tall proud structure now swallowed in velvet darkness. Lavinia, meticulous and lonely since her sister's death, always drew her curtains precisely at 8:47. But tonight, no movement came, no flicker, just the faint outline of a house that should have felt lived in, but now resembled something abandoned. Eliza felt a deep chill, one that crept along her spine with the certainty of instinct, not fear, but recognition. Something had shifted, something irreversible. When morning came, it did not bring peace. The news arrived in fragments, like a broken mirror reflecting too many angles. Lavinia Blackwood, found at the bottom of her staircase, neck twisted, eyes wide open, her face caught in an expression somewhere between shock and revelation. A porcelain figurine lay shattered beside her, and a strange metallic scent clung to the air, sweet and burnt, unplaceable. Eliza said nothing for a long time, but her tea went cold, untouched, and her needle never returned to the tapestry that day. It was just before 7, when the echo of Molly Hemsworth's scream tore through the stillness of Hawthorne Lane, a high splintering sound that fluttered birds from the trees, and sent curtains twitching across the sleepy windows of St Aldhelm's Rise. Molly, the young housemaid barely 17, had stumbled out of the ivy-covered cottage belonging to Miss Edith Lonsdale, spinster, former headmistress, and iron-willed disciplinarian, her apron streaked with soot and panic, eyes wide as if she'd glimpsed something her mind couldn't quite hold. Neighbors emerged in dressing gowns and slippers, gathering in wary clusters as the village constable, Wilfred Talbot, arrived breathless and pale. Within the dim confines of the modest brick cottage, Edith lay crumpled at the foot of the staircase, her body twisted unnaturally, neck bent as though snapped mid-turn, a single embroidered slipper still clinging to her foot. An old kerosene lamp used only in emergencies lay shattered near the stairs, its oil seeping into the worn rug like blood. "Darkness again," muttered Dr. Aldwych, wiping his glasses as he pronounced her gone. Blackout must have thrown her. But Eleanor Finch, retired librarian, and the village's unofficial observer of oddities, knew Edith too well to accept that explanation without question. Edith Lonsdale had survived 2 wars, 3 house fires, and a burglary attempt with nothing but a walking stick and the sheer force of her glare. She was not the kind of woman to stumble blindly in the dark, nor one to light an oil lamp when she so proudly had motion sensor hallway lighting installed to stay modern. That same morning, Eleanor walked to the Lonsdale cottage, under the polite guise of delivering lilies, Edith's least favorite flower. Inside, the air was tinged with something acrid beneath the lavender polish, and while Constable Talbot mumbled through forms and Dr. Aldwych packed away his kit, Eleanor's eyes traced the details others missed. The gas valve by the heater was turned off, yet a faint warmth still radiated from the appliance. A cracked banister edge glistened, freshly splintered, yet no matching impact point could be found, and on the mantelpiece, a photo of Edith and her estranged nephew, Thomas Greaves, had been removed from its usual frame, now lying face down behind a stack of unpaid bills. Eleanor said little, but inside her mind, the pieces began to arrange themselves into a picture she didn't like. Thomas had returned only 4 days ago, smiling too widely, his hands too rehearsed, claiming to patch things up after years of silence. He'd spoken at the pub about old family homes and inheritance headaches just last evening. Mrs. Durrell, the postmistress, overheard him ask about wiring blueprints for the Lonsdale property. Why would a nephew ask that? And more curiously, why had Edith's habitual bark to turn away visitors not been heard that morning? By nightfall, the village was awash with whispers, not grief, but the sharp rustle of suspicion cloaked as civility. Behind every condolence was a second glance, and in the silent hours that followed, Eleanor sat in her chair, knitting untouched in her lap, eyes staring out toward the unlit lane, where secrets moved like wind through hedges, unseen, but never still. The quiet town of Windmere Hollow had always been a place where secrets simmered beneath the surface, like a pot left too long on a low flame, quietly threatening to boil over when least expected. On a crisp Monday morning, The simmering mystery that had lingered for months finally boiled over. Eleanor Weatherby, the reclusive widow, had been found dead at the foot of her conservatory stairs. Her body, still and arranged with an eerie precision, seemed almost too immaculate for an accidental fall. Eleanor, with her finely kept garden and hermit-like existence, had lived a life of calculated quietness. Her sudden death, deemed an accident by the local constable, was far too tidy for Ada Langley to accept as truth. Ada, a woman whose sharp mind had been honed by years of observing human nature and quiet acts of deception, had long suspected that something darker was lurking beneath the surface of Eleanor's life. A love for botany, and an obsession with detail, which she had shared with Eleanor for years, could not explain the sense of growing unease Ada had felt during their recent conversation. Eleanor's cryptic letters had raised red flags, references to shadows creeping in the corners of her greenhouse, strange sounds at night, and the unsettling sensation that things in her house were being moved, just enough to be noticed by no one but me. But it was the line Ada found in the final letter, written just days before Eleanor's death: "If anything happens to me, search the blue vase behind the nursery curtain," that chilled her to the bone. The vase had been in place for years, untouched and undisturbed, a familiar relic of better times before the loneliness of old age had settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders. On the morning after the discovery, Ada arrived at Weatherby House, her steps deliberately quiet, as she approached the door with a modest bouquet in hand: rosemary for remembrance, bluebells for constancy. Mrs. Endicott, Eleanor's companion, who had been employed for only a few months, greeted Ada at the door with a stiff expression, her eyes red-rimmed from the previous night's grieving. There was something too controlled in Mrs. Endicott's demeanor, a practiced sorrow, as if she had rehearsed it. The flowers were offered, the appropriate condolences spoken, but Ada's gaze was already beginning to scan the surroundings, noting the things that were wrong. The house seemed almost too silent, too still. The floor was polished to a shine, the flowers in the hallway arranged as if waiting for company. It was all too immaculate for someone who had died under such sudden, unexplained circumstances. Inside the house, Ada moved through the rooms with the precision of someone who had learned the art of observation from years of tea parties and quiet gatherings in living rooms just like this one. The drawing room, once Eleanor's sanctuary, was eerily undisturbed. The familiar photograph of Eleanor and her late husband, once proudly displayed on the mantel, was absent. Ada's eyes lingered on the spot where it had once stood, now bare, as though a part of the room's soul had been removed. Mrs. Endicott, sensing Ada's scrutiny, offered the flimsy excuse that the photograph had been taken for cleaning. But Ada wasn't convinced. Eleanor had always prided herself on keeping everything in its place, every surface dust-free, and the timing of the photograph's absence was too convenient. In the conservatory, the heart of Eleanor's beloved garden, Ada noted the dampness of the floor, but there were no signs of a fall, no plants uprooted, no overturned pots. Everything was as it had been, save for one thing: the missing journal. The leather-bound book in which Eleanor meticulously documented her botanical discoveries and sketches was nowhere to be found. The absence of it tugged at Ada's mind. It was too important to Eleanor, too cherished for it to be misplaced so carelessly. She bent down to examine the floor near the stairs, where the body had been discovered. A broken teacup lay near the landing, but there were no footprints in the dust, no signs of a struggle. Everything was too pristine, too perfect. Then, as if it were waiting for her to find it, Ada's gaze settled on the mantel once more, this time catching the faint outline of a missing object. The blue vase, Eleanor's prized possession, was now gone. But the vase had been in the nursery. Ada was sure of it. She remembered it clearly from their last visit, nestled next to a delicate orchid, placed just so, and now it had disappeared. It was not the first time something had gone missing, Ada realized. Eleanor had once confided in her about feeling as though things were being rearranged when she wasn't looking, as if someone was subtly altering the order of her life. As Ada stood in the parlor, The room full of things that once spoke of Eleanor's neatness and order. She felt an undeniable unease creeping into her chest. Mrs. Endicott, observing her closely, seemed too intent on maintaining her composed grief. But Ada had no time for false pretenses. Her mind was racing, her thoughts assembling the puzzle pieces faster than she could hold them in place. The missing journal, the missing photograph, the missing vase, the too perfect fall. It was all too clean, too calculated. It was not an accident, and Ada was beginning to suspect that the accident was a carefully orchestrated ruse. Eleanor hadn't fallen. She had been placed there. Later that afternoon, Constable Ridgway came by to confirm what Ada had already known. The cause of death had been a blow to the head, consistent with a fall, but the rest of the evidence didn't add up. The absence of struggle, the deliberate positioning of Eleanor's body, the missing objects. It was too much to dismiss as coincidence, and Ada was certain that someone in that house, had taken great pains to make it look like an accident. That night, as the town of Windmere Hollow settled into its familiar silence, Ada sat by her fireplace, staring at the crackling embers. She retrieved Eleanor's final letter from her coat pocket, and reread it with a renewed sense of urgency. Eleanor had known something was coming. She had been preparing for it, leaving behind clues that Ada would now follow. Clues that spoke not of a fall, but of a planned death, carefully concealed beneath the guise of a simple accident. And Ada Langley, meticulous and unwavering, was prepared to unravel the mystery, no matter how carefully it had been hidden. At dawn, with the light still faint on the horizon, Ada returned to Weatherby House. She would find the answers Eleanor had left behind. Answers that would reveal not just the truth of Eleanor's death, but the dark heart of a tragedy that had been carefully masked for far too long. The missing vase, the journal, the photograph. It would all come to light. And once Ada had uncovered the truth, no one would be able to silence the whispers of Windmere Hollow again. The sun had already begun its slow descent, when Miss Marple found herself seated on the weathered church bench, her gaze soft yet penetrating, as Edmund Drake strode past with his hands tucked deep into his pockets, his face a portrait of thinly veiled impatience. He had returned to the village with an air of arrogance, the news of his Aunt Lavinia's death barely reaching his ears before he set foot back on familiar soil. Miss Marple had known him for many years since his restless childhood, when he was more often in trouble than not, his sullen demeanor matching the storms that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Lavinia, ever the stern matron, had once sent him abroad in hopes of refining his character, but it seemed all that distance had done was distance him further from the better parts of himself. And now, he was here barely a day after the news of her passing, already probing into her affairs with a calculating curiosity. As he cornered Reverend Calthrop after evening prayers, his voice was low but insistent, demanding to know if there was a will. Lavinia, after all, had always been meticulous in such matters. The vicar's response was cautious, his hands clasped as if holding on to something more than just the truth. Indeed, but the solicitor has not yet disclosed its latest terms. Edmund's face betrayed no emotion as he turned, his eyes scanning the Pinkerton garden with a detached, almost clinical interest, as though he were appraising the land itself rather than the legacy of his aunt. Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the bench, rose with a grace that belied her age and approached him with her usual air of composed kindness. "Such a sad affair, Mr. Drake," she remarked softly. "It must be difficult to return under such circumstances." He glanced at her with a faint flicker of disdain, offering only a short nod before dismissing her with his gaze. Yet Miss Marple's voice carried an undercurrent that seemed to catch him off guard. "Family ties have a curious way of revealing themselves, don't they? At the most inconvenient or opportune of times." Her words hung in the air between them, and as she turned to leave, Edmund was left to ponder whether she spoke from mere kindness, or whether there was something more lurking beneath her polite facade. The next day, Miss Marple found herself invited to Pinkerton Cottage, the invitation coming from Mrs. Blackwood, with an urgency that raised her suspicions. The tea, when served, was strong, almost bitter, poured into a cracked porcelain cup that seemed to reflect Mrs. Blackwood's own fractured nerves. Her hands trembled as she poured, betraying a nervousness that had little to do with the tea itself. Mrs. Blackwood, though usually fastidious in her ways, appeared out of sorts as she began to speak of Lavinia. "She was always so strict," Mrs. Blackwood murmured, glancing around the room, her voice lowering as if the very walls might overhear. "Everything had to be just so. Very proper." Miss Marple offered a soft smile, though her mind was already working. "Indeed, but sometimes, such women are the easiest to understand. Their expectations are so predictable." Mrs. Blackwood let out a short, nervous laugh before continuing, her voice tinged with something darker. "But lately she wasn't herself. She became distracted, writing letters, making lists, burning papers." She paused as if unsure whether to continue, but then her voice dropped even lower. "I caught her once, staring at a photograph, crying. When I asked if she was unwell, she snapped at me." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Blackwood's. "Grief can be strange," she said gently, "or guilt. The two often look very much alike." Mrs. Blackwood's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing imperceptibly, though she said nothing more. The conversation lingered uneasily in the room, like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered Reverend Calthrop once more, this time in the churchyard, where he was tending to the newly planted rhododendrons, his fingers gently caressing the delicate blooms. "I thought you might be here," Miss Marple remarked, her voice light, though her gaze was sharp. "The hydrangeas look splendid this year." The vicar looked up, a small smile curling at the corners of his lips. "Ah yes, God's handiwork, though I admit I take some pride in the gardening myself." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, but then in a tone that was almost casual, she asked, "I've heard Lavinia was considering changes to her will. Did she mention anything to you about it?" The vicar hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with something unreadable before he answered, his voice measured. "She did, though not in detail. She came to me 2 weeks ago, very upset. She said she'd made mistakes in the past, things she regretted, and intended to put them right." He paused again, as if weighing whether to reveal more, and then added, "She mentioned family, someone deserving, more deserving than others, though she didn't say who exactly." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on his face, her expression unreadable. "I see," she murmured. "I assume you encouraged her to set things in order then." The vicar gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his lips tight, and Miss Marple, satisfied with the information, let the matter drop for the time being. But the pieces were starting to fall into place. Lavinia's cryptic behavior, her preparations, her mysterious last days. Something wasn't right, and Miss Marple, as always, was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how carefully it had been hidden. Miss Marple had been watching from a distance, seated near the faded pews in the quiet churchyard, her eyes keenly observing Edmund Drake, the prodigal nephew, whose return to St Mary Mead had sparked more than a ripple of gossip. There was a coldness in him now, a sharpness she hadn't seen when he was a boy she remembered all too well, full of restless energy, quick to anger, and perpetually skirting trouble. He'd always been a shadow to his Aunt Lavinia's careful life, her hope that distance would improve him clearly unfulfilled. His sudden appearance just days after her death, asking pointed questions about her will and personal affairs, seemed far too convenient. "I assume there's a will?" he'd inquired of Reverend Calthrop, after evening prayers, his voice carrying that faint edge of entitlement Miss Marple had already begun to find unsettling. The vicar, always a man of careful words, had replied with circumspection, confirming there was indeed a will, but that its most recent contents remained a mystery, its confirmation awaiting the solicitor's arrival. Edmund had nodded, his gaze lingering on the garden, a calculating look crossing his face, as though he were appraising the value of everything in his view. As Miss Marple approached him, her soft footsteps muffled by the early evening mist, she spoke with quiet sympathy. "It must be difficult to return under such circumstances, Mr. Drake," she murmured, her voice gentle but layered with a knowing sharpness. He regarded her with a fleeting flicker of polite disdain, dismissing her with an almost imperceptible nod. Family ties, she continued, have a curious way of revealing themselves at the most inconvenient of times, don't you think? Her words were not lost on him, though he chose not to respond, but left her with the unmistakable impression that he was weighing something in her simple observation. The following day, Miss Marple found herself seated in Mrs. Blackwood's drawing room, a visit prompted by an unusual urgency in the woman's invitation. The tea was served strong, bitter, the kind that seemed to match the edge in Mrs. Blackwood's usually composed demeanor. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she poured, her gaze darting nervously about the room, her words trembling almost as much as her fingers. Lavinia, she was so precise, so correct, Mrs. Blackwood began, her voice barely above a whisper. But lately, well, she wasn't herself. She was distracted, writing strange letters, burning papers in the fire, and there was that photograph she kept staring at, crying over it. When I asked her what was wrong, she snapped at me. Miss Marple listened intently, the woman's discomfort revealing more than she intended. Grief can be curious. Yes, Miss Marple responded softly, her mind already moving faster than the conversation. But perhaps it's not grief. Perhaps it's guilt. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, an imperceptible flicker of suspicion crossing her face as Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly, offering no further words but letting the silence stretch between them. Later, in the churchyard, Miss Marple encountered Reverend Calthrop, who was tending to the newly planted rhododendrons near the vestry. The vicar, normally so composed, looked up with a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. God's handiwork is patient, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts, though I admit I take some pride in these. Miss Marple's voice was gentle yet probing as she asked, "Did Lavinia speak to you about her will? I've heard she was considering changes." The vicar's hesitation was palpable, a pause that spoke volumes. "She did," he finally admitted, his tone cautious. "She was upset, spoke of mistakes from the past, things she wanted to set right. She mentioned her family, but not by name, only that there was someone who deserved more than others, someone who expected nothing." Miss Marple's mind raced, pieces beginning to align. Edmund Drake's cold, calculating manner, Mrs. Blackwood's evasions, the photograph, the unsettling sense that Lavinia had known something far darker than her outwardly perfect life suggested. And then, Mrs. Partridge, ever the village gossip, dropped her bombshell with a gleam in her eye. "Lavinia once told me the past wasn't as buried as it seemed," she whispered to Miss Marple one afternoon. "She said that and she was so careful with everything." But there were raised voices, heated exchanges, her and Mrs. Blackwood. "I thought it was just over a misunderstanding, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple, as ever, listened carefully, absorbing every word, every flicker of emotion. Later, in the quiet of her own home, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of a small notebook she never wrote in. She preferred thinking, sorting, arranging the threads of the case in her mind. The secrets were slowly beginning to emerge from the darkness, but Miss Marple could sense the sharp edge of someone's fear. Someone had been so desperate to silence Lavinia, that they had done so carefully, methodically, not in a fit of rage, but in cold, deliberate action. There was something more, something that tied the whispers of guilt, the strange behavior, and the calculated return of Edmund Drake. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts sharp as ever, knowing the killer was still hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. Miss Blackwood sat there, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, her face buried in her trembling hands. It wasn't the kind of display one might expect in front of others. No dramatic gestures, no outward show of theatrics. It was raw grief, the kind that comes in the silence when no one is watching, when there's no need to mask the pain. Miss Marple, ever the discreet observer, slowed her steps as she neared. She had almost decided to turn back when Mrs. Blackwood, sensing her presence, looked up. Their gazes locked for a brief moment, and in that fleeting instant, Miss Marple could see the vulnerability, the loneliness that was so deeply hidden beneath Mrs. Blackwood's polished exterior. "Oh," the woman stammered, quickly adjusting her coat, trying to mask the raw emotion she hadn't intended to reveal. "I was just out for a bit of air. The house feels so dreadfully empty, that's all." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, understanding, yet her words held a layer of something more, something sharp beneath the kindness. "Quite understandable," she said softly. "The silence of absence can often be louder than we expect." Mrs. Blackwood dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, a fragile smile playing at the edges of her lips, but the sadness never quite left. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," she murmured, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. I don't like to make a scene." Miss Marple, ever composed, smiled back warmly. "Nor do I," she replied with a lightness that belied the keen observation in her eyes. "But I've always found tears to be among the most honest things we possess, especially when words fail us." Mrs. Blackwood gave a stiff nod, then silently slipped into the shadows, her figure vanishing into the dimming evening light. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, watching the faint outline of the woman disappear, the questions swirling in her mind like a fog that wouldn't lift. Tears. Yes, but what was she truly grieving for? Or was it someone else? The following day, the unexpected news spread across St Mary Mead like wildfire. Edmund Drake, the cool and distant nephew of the late Lavinia Blackwood, would be leaving the village by the end of the week. It was an announcement that came not with a formal statement, but in a casual conversation on the village green, where Edmund stood beside his motorcar, his posture rigid, and his voice clipped as he spoke with Constable Evans. "I have pressing business in London," Edmund said with a flick of his cigarette. "Aunt Lavinia wouldn't have wanted me to linger unnecessarily." Constable Evans, unsure of how to respond, offered a vague nod. "Of course, sir," he muttered, though it was clear he didn't know how to handle the situation. "But strictly speaking, we haven't yet closed the file on her passing. An unfortunate fall, wasn't it?" Edmund's eyes flickered briefly, then he answered in a tone that could only be described as dismissive. "Surely that's the prevailing theory, Constable." Just as Miss Marple approached, overhearing the conversation, she offered a smile that barely reached her eyes. "Very few things in St Mary Mead prevail without further inspection," she said lightly, though her words carried a weight that lingered in the air long after they were spoken. "And some falls, though they appear simple, are rarely as uncomplicated as they seem." Edmund, who had been standing with his arms crossed, dropped his smirk for a moment, his eyes narrowing, as he met Miss Marple's gaze. "You think there's more to it than a simple tumble, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice suddenly cold. "Oh, I always believe there's more, Miss Drake," Miss Marple replied with a quiet confidence. "Life is far too intricate to be reduced to simplicity." Edmund crushed his cigarette beneath his polished shoe with a sudden, almost violent motion. "I do hope, for everyone's sake, that we're not chasing shadows," he said, his tone heavy with something unspoken.
"No," Miss Marple replied without turning around. "But the trouble with shadows, Mr. Drake, is that they often point to what's blocking the light." She didn't glance back as she walked away, but she could feel Edmund's gaze following her, cold and calculating. There was something unsettling about the way he seemed so eager to disappear, to erase himself from the situation. Some people, she mused, wished to vanish without a trace far too quickly. Later that day, Constable Evans made a discovery, one that would alter the course of the investigation. While sorting through the side cabinet near the stairway in Miss Pinkerton's home, he found it, a small brown bottle, identical to the one found near the body of Miss Lavinia Blackwood, carefully tucked beneath a stack of folded linens. This bottle, however, was different. It had a prescription label, "Mrs. Beatrice Blackwood, 15 milligrams, sleep aid. Take one as needed." Evans brought the bottle to Miss Marple's attention the following day, his confusion evident. "I don't understand, Miss Marple," he said, holding out the bottle, his brow furrowed. "It's the same pills, surely. But why would Mrs. Blackwood's medication be found among the deceased's belongings?" Miss Marple turned the bottle over slowly in her hands, her eyes scanning the label with a quiet intensity. "Have you asked her about it?" Evans nodded, still puzzled. "She says that Miss Lavinia sometimes asked for one of the pills to help her sleep.
She claims she kept them nearby in case Miss Lavinia called for her during the night. Miss Marple pondered this for a moment, then spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Very plausible, she mused. But also rather curious. She turned her gaze to the village beyond, where the wind rustled the hedges, and the grey sky of late spring threatened rain. You see, Constable, she said, her voice taking on a reflective tone. Lavinia was a woman of strict habits. I recall, only recently, how she refused tea and biscuits at the women's circle, because they were made with margarine. Would a woman so particular about what she consumed have taken someone else's medication, especially so freely? Evans looked at her, his uncertainty deepening. No, Miss Marple replied softly. She would not have. There's something off here, Constable. Something beneath the surface that we have yet to uncover. As the words left her mouth, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were closer than they appeared, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The pieces were falling into place, but the full puzzle had yet to be completed. There were shadows lingering in the corners, and Miss Marple was determined to bring them into the light. Miss Blackwood's delicate fingers trembled as she held the letter, her lips pressed into a thin line as though steeling herself against the weight of its contents. She sat there in the dim light, the shadows of the late afternoon falling softly over the room, her mind racing. It wasn't the first time she had received unexpected communication, but this one carried the weight of something far darker than mere words. The letter, apparently from Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, arrived by post just days before her untimely death. A will vaguely written, with no specifics, no names, only a cryptic mention of a change in beneficiaries. Odd. Miss Blackwood had known Miss Lavinia for years, and the woman's meticulous nature was legendary. Such a document, especially regarding her estate, would have been signed, sealed and prepared with care, certainly not delivered in such an unceremonious manner. 2 days later, Mr. Pritchard, the village solicitor, his thinning grey hair more unkempt than usual, appeared before Constable Evans. In his hands was the same letter, and it was as perplexing to him as it was to Miss Blackwood. This, Mr. Pritchard explained, was left for me to prepare a new will. But there was no follow-up, no second copy. It is as though Miss Lavinia intended to make a change, but then vanished before she could complete the task. Evans was perplexed too, and when Miss Marple came by later that morning, he handed her the letter. Her sharp eyes studied the handwriting, noting the slightly rounded loops, the uneven pressure on the descenders. It was like Miss Lavinia, but not quite. The signature was less rigid, less precise, an attempt to mimic, but the authenticity was gone. A forgery. Miss Marple mused softly, tapping the letter with her fingers. It is as though someone was trying to recreate her handwriting, perhaps in a rush, perhaps out of fear. Evans, still puzzled, asked, "Do you think it was meant to trick us into believing she had a change of heart?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. Precisely. But why no follow-up visit to the solicitor? Why no second copy at home? If she was planning something significant, one would expect more than just a single hastily written note. The answer seemed elusive, but Miss Marple wasn't ready to dismiss the matter just yet. She leaned in closer, her voice a whisper as she handed the letter back to Evans. Forgery, Constable, is much like makeup. It can enhance a resemblance, but it can never capture the real essence. The rumors began to spread, as they always did in the close-knit village of St Mary Mead. Mrs. Nettleton, sitting in the midst of a heated game of bridge at the Women's Guild, casually mentioned seeing someone near Miss Pinkerton's house on the night of the blackout. A tall man, she said, taller than she was at least, but the darkness had obscured his features. The comment passed without much attention at first, but later, when pressed by Miss Marple, Mrs. Nettleton grew more specific. "I thought it was Reverend Calthrop," she admitted hesitantly, her face flushed with uncertainty. "He walks that way sometimes, but I couldn't say for sure." Miss Marple, ever the careful listener, took note of the details. She later approached the vicar with a carefully posed question. "I do hope you weren't caught outside during that dreadful blackout, Reverend." The vicar, genuinely surprised, shook his head. "Goodness no, Miss Marple. I was in the study the entire evening. Mrs. Calthrop can confirm that, of course." The blackout didn't affect me at all, and I only went out briefly to fetch the dog. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something about his answer that didn't sit right. The contradiction. It was as if the darkness had made him forget his own movements. A common trait when people believed no one was watching. And that, Miss Marple knew, was often when they were at their most dangerous. The garden behind Miss Pinkerton's cottage, though modest, was meticulously cared for. Every flower and hedge in perfect alignment, just as Miss Pinkerton had always kept things. But it was Constable Evans who first noticed the irregularity. One muddy boot print, partially obscured by a tangle of ivy, and the spring daffodils, barely noticeable, unless one was looking closely. He called in Edmund Drake, the last person to have seen Miss Pinkerton alive, to examine the print. At first glance, the match seemed undeniable. Size, tread, even the heel alignment, all pointed toward Edmund's well-polished leather boots. Evans, feeling quite pleased with himself, looked toward Edmund for confirmation. But the young man's expression shifted, his eyes darkening with a brief flicker of something unsettling. Quite the coincidence, Edmund muttered under his breath, though his words were carefully measured. It looks like me, doesn't it? He had a tendency to distance himself from any potential association with Miss Pinkerton's death, and his demeanor, as ever, was too perfect, too rehearsed. Evans, eager to pin something concrete on him, glanced at Miss Marple, who had been standing in the background, observing quietly. Miss Marple, however, wasn't so sure. "Coincidences are funny things," she murmured. "Sometimes they point us exactly where we need to look, but other times they lead us astray." And that was when she knew someone was orchestrating this puzzle with such careful precision that every move seemed calculated to mislead, to confuse, and to divert attention away from the truth. The carefully placed footprints, the forged letter, the veiled insinuations, it was all connected. But by whom? And why? The answer, Miss Marple sensed, was closer than anyone realized. The pieces were falling into place, but only she could see the pattern. And when it was revealed, the truth would be far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Miss Marple stood in the dim light of the garden, her eyes narrowing as she examined the muddy print. It wasn't as fresh as she had hoped, the edges crumbling, almost as if the ground itself had refused to retain the memory of its intruder. "This garden," she mused quietly, "hasn't seen a drop of water for days. The mud, it's brittle, too brittle to be from just yesterday. This print must be old." Evans scratched his head, his confusion thickening. "But Miss Marple, the prints from days ago, surely 3 or maybe 4. She nodded, but her mind was already trailing down a different path. "Yes, but prints tell you where someone has been, not where they are now. This is a subtle diversion, a misdirection meant to confuse." Evans hesitated but followed her logic, the idea of false clues settling in. Miss Marple's sharp gaze returned to the print. "It's a clever red herring, but I suspect the mind behind this puzzle is even sharper than we initially thought." Later that evening, Miss Marple found herself ensnared in her usual quiet storm of thoughts. The more she pieced together, the more elusive the truth became. Every new lead brought with it a cascade of doubt. Mrs. Blackwood, financially cornered, had the motive, a desperate need to maintain her social standing. But was she capable of murder? Her sorrow had seemed genuine, raw even, when she had wept at the vicarage. Could such a delicate exterior mask something so sinister? Edmund Drake, too, was a puzzle. His position of convenience had placed him at the center of it all, present when needed, evasive when questioned. But he lacked the vicious streak one might expect in a man of ambition. His boots had left prints at the scene, but they were not aligned with the critical timeline. And the forgery of Lavania's letter seemed too poorly executed for someone as calculated as he appeared. Then there was the vicar, so gentle and dutiful, but too silent on certain matters. Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder, if he had been near Lavania's house that night, why was he denying it so adamantly? Was he trying to shield someone else? And Lavania herself, so meticulously controlled, so methodical in her ways. What had caused her to suddenly spiral into secrecy in her final weeks? A change in her will,
her photograph mysteriously gone, strange letters sent. Was it all to obscure her intentions? What about Claire, the elusive niece who had never been seen, her name mentioned only in passing, with no face to match? There were too many pieces, too many questions, none of them aligning into anything concrete. Miss Marple poured her tea, her thoughts swirling like the dark liquid in her cup. She knew that guilt often had a voice, faint but there, a hurried sob, an overly confident statement, an out-of-place detail that no one else had noticed. Someone had slipped up, someone had left a clue in plain sight without meaning to, and now it was up to her to listen closely enough to hear it. The next day, as the village bustled in its usual quiet manner, Miss Marple sought out the parish records. It wasn't an act of idle curiosity. No, she needed something more. There in the fading ink of the old baptismal logs, she found it. Beatrice Blackwood. The name stood out like a solitary figure in a fog, not for its obvious connections, but for the omission of a vital detail. Mrs. Blackwood had claimed to have arrived in St Mary Mead by a different path, but the truth was far murkier. Beatrice had been employed as a matron's assistant at St Mildred's Home for the Frail, a place that had been shut down years ago, after a scandal that had never fully been explained. Patient neglect, strange deaths, articles had hinted at darker truths, but no one had dared to investigate further. The fact that Mrs. Blackwood had never mentioned this chapter in her past, had never breathed a word about it, was a puzzle that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. Mrs. Blackwood's clean facade was peeling away, bit by bit, revealing a past she had hoped to bury. Something in her kept her secrets close, and Miss Marple intended to find out what that something was, no matter how long it took. The weight of the unsolved mystery hung thick in the air, and Miss Marple felt certain now, there was more to this than mere happenstance. Someone had been playing a dangerous game, and they had made a crucial mistake. They had underestimated the sharpness of Miss Marple's mind. Miss Marple sat quietly in her modest drawing room, the faint buzz of the village outside barely reaching her ears, as she sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting between the strange events that had unfurled over the past few days. It was clear to her now that every piece of evidence pointed towards something far more intricate than a simple domestic tragedy. There were too many veiled truths, too many shadows, and yet the heart of the mystery remained maddeningly elusive. Mrs. Blackwood, for all her apparent distress, held a secret in the clasp of her hand, an old tarnished secret, tied to the delicate threads of her past. What had she hidden so carefully? Miss Marple's sharp mind raced, remembering the photo missing from Lavinia Pinkerton's mantel, the one picture Lavinia had cherished most, the photograph of Claire, the child she had raised, and perhaps the one whom she had truly meant to inherit her estate. A quiet unease settled over Miss Marple, as she thought back to the odd disappearance of that photograph, which had always seemed so much a part of Lavinia's life, tucked neatly within the arrangement of lace and flowers on the mantel. Why would it vanish just when the matter of Lavinia's estate was coming to the forefront? What was being concealed beneath the polished surfaces of the village's gossip-filled calm? It was during one of her many quiet conversations with the ever-chattering Mrs. Partridge, who seemed to know more than she realized, that a crucial fragment of information slid into place. Lavinia had been writing letters, private letters, handwritten and sealed away. Mrs. Partridge had seen her post these letters herself, rather than entrusting them to the local mail, speaking in a tone that suggested something weighty, something urgent. "I have a letter to send to someone who ought to know the truth," she had said. The cryptic words clung to Miss Marple's mind like the scent of old paper, hinting at the powerful secret Lavinia had been intent on sharing before her untimely death. It was then, in the flickering glow of the hearth in Lavinia's home, that Miss Marple's suspicion sharpened like the edge of a knife. Lavinia's fiery resolve had not been about the warmth of comfort. It had been about keeping the secrets of those she loved and feared most burning bright, perhaps long enough to leave someone else in the dark forever. Had she known she would be silenced before the truth could escape her lips? Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder if the carefully concealed photograph, the writing, and the letters were all part of a delicate game. Lavinia's fear, palpable even to those who had been close to her,
was not one born out of suspicion, but one forged from a quiet, terrible certainty. She had known what was coming, and it was no mere accident. Someone had been far more interested in keeping her silent, and for a reason that stretched far beyond the reach of village whispers. As Miss Marple sat in the cold, silent room, she began to piece together the final moments leading to Lavinia's death. Each stitch, each whisper, each fleeting glance revealing a larger tapestry, one that hinted at betrayal, a deep-seated resentment, and a clever game where even the most trusted of allies could be the perpetrators. The truth, as always, was more dangerous than anyone realized, and Miss Marple was the only one who truly understood its weight. She was, after all, the keeper of the silence between the words. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room, but it was the ash beneath the poker that held Miss Marple's attention. As she carefully retrieved the burnt remnants of what was once a letter, she could feel the heat of the truth smoldering just beneath the surface. Delicate fragments of charred paper crumbled between her fingers, and she gently brushed away the debris with her handkerchief, revealing a few words clinging stubbornly to the scorched edges. My late sister's child. Claire must be told. Solicitor change will. There, amidst the blackened remains, Miss Marple found a name that had long slipped from her memory. Claire Whitmore. A name once whispered in hushed tones, now resurfacing like a spectre from the past. Her breath quickened, a subtle but telling shift in her usually composed demeanor. Lavinia had known all along. She had planned to make a final correction, to right a wrong that had festered for far too long. Her will had been clear in intent. Claire was to inherit, not Edmund with his insincere smiles, or Mrs. Blackwood with her air of silent control. The letter had never been posted, though. Had it? Someone had made sure of that. Someone who had known about Claire, had known about Lavinia's quiet rebellion, and had done everything in their power to prevent it from being revealed. Whoever had been the last to see Lavinia's private affairs, had not just kept her secret, they had extinguished it, leaving only the faintest traces of a truth too dangerous to let breathe. As Miss Marple folded the remaining fragments of the letter, her mind raced. She remembered Lavinia's younger sister, the delicate girl taken away so many years ago. Her life cut short by illness, the child whisked away by distant relatives to some far-off corner of Europe. Claire, Lavinia's cherished niece, had always been the heir in spirit, but it wasn't until now that Miss Marple fully understood how far Lavinia had been willing to go to make it official. The more Miss Marple pieced together, the more she could see the sharp angles of motive forming. Edmund's motives were obvious. He had too much to gain, but he had been blind to Claire's existence, blind to the one person who could steal everything from him. Mrs. Blackwood, on the other hand, had seen the letter. She had felt the tremors of change long before Lavinia's death, and perhaps she had been the one to intercept it. A woman who had remained just beneath the surface of Lavinia's life, always present, but never quite part of it. Mrs. Blackwood had known. The signs were there. Too many smooth gestures, too many rehearsed answers, too many moments when her eyes flickered with guilt too quickly, for it to be anything other than fear. Miss Marple had always been attuned to these small signals, these quiet betrayals, and it was clear now Mrs. Blackwood had much to lose. But what did she fear? The inheritance? Perhaps, but there was something deeper, something tied to the very identity of the people involved. It wasn't simply about money or property. It was about control, about rewriting the narrative of their lives. Claire had been erased from the story, her name wiped clean, her rightful place in Lavinia's world threatened. Yet here it was, lingering in the corners, waiting to be uncovered. The photograph, the letter, the strange precautions surrounding Lavinia's personal belongings, it all told a story. Mrs. Blackwood, who had once served quietly, dutifully, in the background, had feared what Lavinia's final decisions would bring. She had thought herself safe, her position secure, until the shadow of Claire's return loomed on the horizon. The truth was never quite so simple. Miss Marple knew. It was buried, hidden, left to smolder beneath the surface. And now, it was rising like smoke, revealing the fear that had driven so many to actions they would soon regret. Mrs. Blackwood had protected Lavinia's secrets, but in doing so, she had revealed herself. She was no longer the quiet observer. She was the orchestrator of a darker, more dangerous game, one in which Lavinia's final, most honest act was the first move. The truth had not just been buried, it had been extinguished. But now, it was ready to burn once more. Miss Marple sat by the dimming fire, the warmth of the room contrasting sharply with the icy chill of the truth now unfurling in her mind. The crime, she mused, had not been born of malice or hatred. No, it was the desperation of a woman, cornered by the passage of time and fading relevance, that had led her to such an extreme act. A life shaped by silence, the walls closing in until there was no choice but to erase the evidence that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance. But Miss Marple knew better than most. Truth, like a shadow, could not remain hidden forever. It always found a way to emerge. She glanced toward the fireplace, where fragments of the past still lingered, the charred edges of the letter slowly revealing themselves, whispering the secrets they had been forced to keep. She could hear the soft crackle of the fire, as the room fell silent. This was not a mystery solved by force, but by quiet understanding. Miss Marple had never believed in forceful confrontations. She had learned long ago that the most profound confessions came not from threats but from the gentle touch of empathy. That afternoon, she had asked Constable Evans to arrange a simple gathering. No formal summons, no sharp questions, just tea and the company of those who had been so close to Lavinia's life. Edmund Drake arrived with the faintest air of boredom, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, his eyes scanning the room as though already certain he was untouchable. Reverend Calthrop's expression was one of calm concern, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Mrs. Partridge couldn't hide the excitement in her gaze, sensing something was afoot, while Mrs. Blackwood entered last, her usual mask of composure still in place, though her hands trembled just slightly as she adjusted her shawl. Miss Marple greeted them all with her customary warmth before taking her seat by the fire, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. "I was thinking of Lavinia today," she began softly, the room hanging on her every word, particularly that photograph she kept on the mantel of her late sister and dear little Claire. She paused, letting the name linger in the air like a question. Mrs. Blackwood stiffened, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "You remember it, don't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle, almost affectionate. "It vanished, you know, just before Lavinia died." The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Blackwood's face remained a careful mask, but the slight tremor of her hand gave her away. "And then," Miss Marple said, almost matter-of-factly, "there was the letter, the one Lavinia had written to Claire, the one that never reached her." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes flickered toward the small package Miss Marple had laid on the table, wrapped in linen, delicate and ancient. Miss Marple unfolded it with a slow precision, revealing the burnt edges of the letter's fragments, curling upward like the last traces of a secret too long buried. "These," Miss Marple continued, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Blackwood, "I found in the fireplace. Lavinia had written to her niece, to Claire. She had intended to find her, to bring her back into her life." Miss Marple's voice grew softer, but the weight of her words only seemed to deepen the silence in the room. "I think she had regrets. Years of silence between them, and at the end a desire to make things right. She wanted to give Claire what was hers by birthright. Not Edmund, not Mrs. Blackwood, but someone didn't want that to happen. Someone couldn't bear to see that future come to pass, and so they made sure that letter was never posted. They made sure Claire would never know the truth." She paused, letting the implications hang heavy in the air. Mrs. Blackwood's expression had not shifted, but Miss Marple could feel the shift within her, the delicate unraveling of a mask carefully constructed over years of fear. "It's funny," Miss Marple mused, her tone still soft, "how some people only recognize the value of a future when it's slipping through their fingers, and how much further they're willing to go to ensure they hold on to what they think is theirs." The silence in the room grew palpable. Edmund's indifference had vanished, replaced by a sharp curiosity. Mrs. Partridge's eyes widened with realization, while the Reverend's brows furrowed as the pieces began to fall into place. But Mrs. Blackwood, the center of it all, remained still, her expression a mask of quiet panic. Miss Marple knew then that the truth was no longer a secret. It was a quiet confession in the air, lingering between them, as inevitable as the dawn. And Miss Marple, with her unerring understanding of human nature, knew that this story, like all secrets, was on the verge of unraveling completely. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered as she spoke, her voice a delicate whisper in the thick, suffocating silence that hung in the room like a storm cloud. She folded her hands in her lap, the weight of the moment pressing down on each of them. Each word she spoke imbued with the gravity of a revelation that was nearly too much to bear. If Claire had received that letter, she murmured, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, I dare say she would have returned. And Lavinia's will, already in the process of being amended, might have taken a very different turn. She paused, allowing the impact of her words to settle over the group. Mrs. Partridge's breath caught in her throat, but it was Mrs. Blackwood who had the most visible reaction. Her once composed face flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible tremor of fear. Miss Marple watched this with a knowing expression. But you see, she continued softly, her voice still even, Claire never received that letter. Someone intercepted it. Someone who knew its significance. Someone who understood what it would mean for Claire's future, and who could not afford to have that future threatened. A sharp, almost inaudible intake of breath from Mrs. Blackwood confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Her eyes didn't meet the detective's. Instead they fluttered to her lap, hands now trembling in a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of control. You, Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Marple said, the words hanging like a shroud in the air, are the one who took that letter. You burned it. You removed the photograph. Mrs. Blackwood's pale lips parted, but no words came. The detective continued, relentless but gentle. And when Lavinia insisted on posting another letter the next morning, you knew you could not allow it. You couldn't risk Claire's return. You knew what that would mean. Your comfort, your position, everything you had worked for would be torn away, and you would be left with nothing but the cold, stark reality of your own insignificance. The room seemed to freeze, the air thick with the weight of truth now hanging in the room. You waited for the blackout, Miss Marple said, her voice almost tender, yet unwavering. You knew her routine, knew when she'd be coming down the stairs, perhaps with her sleeping draught in hand, and then when she reached the fourth step, you struck. You pushed her, and then you arranged the scene carefully, methodically, leaving the heater on, creating confusion, and letting the darkness do the rest. Mrs. Blackwood's hands were now clenched tightly together, her body rigid as the truth crashed down upon her. Her eyes were wide, bright with unshed tears. But no apology came, no plea for mercy. Miss Marple's voice softened, but the finality of her words left no room for doubt. She did not die from the fall alone, Miss Marple whispered. She died from the betrayal. The quiet, cold betrayal of trust. And that, she said, her eyes meeting Mrs. Blackwood's with piercing clarity, was the cruelest betrayal of all. The room fell into a hushed silence, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire, as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, its sharp edges cutting through the facade Mrs. Blackwood had so carefully constructed. The room hung heavy with unspoken words, the tension thick enough to feel like it was pressing against every wall. Miss Marple's voice cut through the stillness, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Blackwood, whose pale, trembling hands clutched at her lap, as if to steady herself against the oncoming storm. There were no bruises, Miss Marple said, her tone calm, yet laden with undeniable certainty. No marks of a struggle. You didn't need to fight her. Just a small calculated push, enough to send Lavinia tumbling down the stairs. And when she lay still, you took a moment. The gas heater, turned on with such deliberate precision. A murmur rippled through the room. Constable Evans's eyes narrowed, his confusion flickering. But Miss Marple offered no explanation at first. Instead she let the silence stretch, the weight of her words hanging between them. By lighting that heater, she continued, her gaze unrelenting, you created a web of confusion. The room's warmth, that false sense of lingering life,
This illusion that Lavinia had been alive far longer than she truly was. The doctor didn't question it. No one did. But I did. She paused, a flicker of something deep in her eyes, as she turned to address the others. But Mrs. Blackwood seemed trapped in her own internal battle. Lavinia never used that heater, Miss Marple said quietly. Not once in all her years. She couldn't stand the smell, always relied on the central heating. But there it was, lit. Why? Someone who knew the house, knew her habits, knew her vulnerabilities, could have easily turned it on, carefully staging a scene to make it seem like Lavinia had simply tripped, maybe too drowsy from her medication to notice. A ripple of realization passed through the room as Mrs. Blackwood's face tightened, but still she said nothing. Only someone who knew the house intimately, who understood the routine inside and out, could have orchestrated such a scene with such subtlety. Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from Mrs. Blackwood, whose face had begun to lose its composure. And then Miss Marple added, her voice even softer but laced with quiet finality. We come to the missing photograph. That silver-framed picture, always in its place, of Lavinia's sister and little Claire, smiling on the garden bench, not remarkable in itself, unless you knew what it represented. She let the silence deepen, watching the flicker of discomfort in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes. But it vanished, didn't it? Not misplaced, not forgotten, but deliberately removed. Edmund shifted uncomfortably, his unease palpable, but Miss Marple dismissed his thoughts with a mere glance. Lavinia had been speaking of her sister again, Miss Marple said gently, but with an edge of truth that cut through the room. She'd been reconnecting with the past, reflecting, perhaps even regretting, not hiding from it. And yet you removed that photo, not out of sentimentality, but out of fear. Fear of what it would reveal. That photograph would have linked Claire to Lavinia's intentions. It would have shown the world who Lavinia had meant to inherit. And the moment it was shown to the solicitor, or worse, to Claire herself, the truth would have been undeniable. Miss Marple paused, locking eyes with Mrs. Blackwood, as the weight of her words settled like a storm on the horizon. You didn't just hide it. You erased it. You bought yourself time, hoping that before the truth caught up with you, everything would be buried. Mrs. Blackwood's face crumpled, a mixture of grief and something darker passing through her expression. Defeat, perhaps, or the sharp sting of regret too late. Miss Marple's voice softened, her words now more a reflection of understanding than condemnation. You weren't evil, Mrs. Blackwood. You were frightened. But fear, when twisted by jealousy and the need for survival, can push even the most decent people to acts of unthinkable betrayal. Her gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, it seemed as though she might offer some shred of compassion, but her focus sharpened once again. Lavinia loved order. In her house, in her garden, in her life, and now, she said, her voice quiet, but resolute, that order has been restored, not through chaos, but through truth, even if that truth came wrapped in silence and shadows. Mrs. Blackwood's shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of resolve crumbling, as she finally whispered, her voice trembling with unshed tears. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to stop it, to delay it. I didn't think it would come to this. Her voice faltered, barely above a whisper. Miss Marple, calm as ever, said nothing in return. She had seen it before, the moment when guilt consumed resolve, when fear turned into sorrow, and when the weight of one's actions could no longer be denied. Reverend Calthrop stepped forward, his face full of quiet sympathy. You chose poorly, he said softly, his voice gentle, but firm. But you're not alone in that. Mrs. Blackwood nodded, her eyes glassy, her spirit broken. I thought if I could just buy more time, if I could find a way to stop it. She trailed off, her voice trembling. Time, Miss Marple knew, had already slipped away from her. Time, for all its power, was a thing that never waited. Not for fear, not for regret. And in Mrs. Blackwood's terror, she had chosen silence, hoping it might shield her from the inevitable. The room had grown unbearably still,
the air thick with anticipation, and the faint scent of something unspoken. Mrs. Blackwood, her hands trembling, faced the gathered crowd, each eye upon her, as though expecting the unthinkable. Miss Marple's words had struck a chord, resonating with an undeniable truth that no one could now ignore. The gas heater, previously a point of confusion, suddenly made sense. It wasn't simply an overlooked detail. It was the key to the web of deceit. The warmth of the room, so carefully orchestrated, told a lie. Lavinia had not been dead as long as the scene suggested. She had been murdered, not by a loud confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate manipulation. Mrs. Blackwood, caught in her own web, stood frozen, her face pale, her gaze never meeting anyone's eyes. The missing photograph, so innocuous in appearance, but so damning in its absence, revealed the true motive. Lavinia's sister, the one Mrs. Blackwood feared, was a thread in a story she thought could be unraveled before it ever reached her. But no, the missing image had sealed the fate of the one person who had seen too much. The final unraveling came when Miss Marple gently, almost mercifully, revealed the twisted heart of the matter. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't evil, not truly. She had been driven by a terror more paralyzing than malice, fear of being overshadowed, erased, forgotten in the wake of Lavinia's burgeoning reconnection with the past. The tears that fell were not for show. They were the tears of a woman who had realized too late that the silence she had clung to, the secrecy she had nurtured, had cost her more than she could ever repay. And so, as Constable Evans led her away, there was no anger in the room, only the strange quiet sorrow of a truth that had finally been set free. Weeks passed before Claire Whitmore, with an air of reluctant grace, arrived in St Mary Mead. The villagers took notice, but no one could say for certain if they were looking at her with pity, or with an unspoken recognition of the weight she carried. The house, now her inheritance, was a strange, haunting reminder of a life she had never fully known. Miss Marple met her at the station, and the exchange was soft, gentle, the way old friends might speak after years of silence. Claire had been unaware of the letters her aunt had written, but Miss Marple knew. Sometimes truths are lost in transit, sometimes they are silenced by the hands of fate. Edmund Drake, once so sure of his place, had vanished without a trace, his departure barely remarked upon. The house passed from one hand to another, the name Whitmore now gracing the gate instead of Pinkerton. Yet, in the quiet shift, there was a sense of justice, not in the loud declarations of triumph, but in the subtle change of hands, the soft whisper of a legacy reclaimed. The town, now with the air of normalcy restored, resumed its steady rhythm, as though nothing had ever occurred to disturb its peace. The villagers no longer looked at Miss Marple with mere curiosity, but with a quiet, respectful recognition. She was not just the old, harmless observer. They had seen what she was capable of when it came to unearthing the truth. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but in her quiet, unassuming way, she had unraveled a mystery so deeply buried in the bones of their lives that no one could have anticipated it. One evening, as the light waned and shadows stretched long over the garden, Miss Marple sat with Reverend Calthrop, reflecting on the strange tangled paths that fear and desperation can take. It was never hatred that drove her, Miss Marple mused, her voice low, almost meditative. It was fear, the kind that gnaws quietly at your heart, the fear of being left behind, of becoming a ghost in your own life. It's always the silence, the quiet ones you need to watch. They don't scream, they fester in the dark, until one day, when they're ready, they strike. Fear, you see, is far more dangerous than hatred ever could be. The vicar nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit, and they sat there in the garden, the weight of their conversation hanging between them, knowing that some things are never truly finished, only put to rest. He offered her another biscuit, though she declined politely, a soft smile on her lips. "I do think," she added, her voice barely above a whisper, that in the end, Lavinia might have forgiven her. Her words carried weight, a quiet understanding, as though she had seen enough of human nature to know how deeply fear could shape a person. Lavinia, who had been so afraid of being forgotten, might have seen that same terror in Mrs. Blackwood. The garden seemed to agree with a subtle rustling of leaves, as if nature itself acknowledged the complexity of human emotion. Miss Marple, ever thoughtful, stood, her delicate frame casting a long shadow in the soft evening light. She straightened her blouse, preparing to return to her beloved roses. The lights in the vicarage flickered, then steadied into a warm glow. St Mary Mead, after everything, was no longer shrouded in darkness, not in any sense of the word. The quiet corners of the village had whispered truths in the most unexpected of ways. In those silent moments, Miss Marple had pieced together something far more profound than the usual pursuit of justice, a quiet revelation of human fragility. It wasn't hatred or greed that had led to such a meticulously staged crime, but something far more raw: fear. Fear of being left behind, of fading into obscurity, of losing one's place. Mrs. Blackwood, for all her faults, was not a villain in the traditional sense. She was a woman slowly crushed under the weight of a society that had passed her by, her sense of security slowly eroding. In the end, she clung to the life she thought she deserved, and in her desperation, she crossed a line that could never be undone. Miss Marple had not chased after justice with force, but had instead allowed the truth to surface at its own pace, like sunlight breaking through a fog. It was this patient, subtle unraveling that made Miss Marple's brilliance so unique. She understood that wickedness is not always born of malice. Sometimes it's born of quiet panic, the fear of being forgotten, the dread of being irrelevant. If you had been in Lavinia's shoes, knowing that someone close to you could betray you out of fear, could you have seen it coming? And what of Claire, who inherited it all? Did she ever truly need to know the full truth of her aunt's past, or was ignorance a blessing in this case? What do you think? Was Mrs. Blackwood deserving of sympathy, or was justice rightly served? Share your thoughts and theories below, and don't forget to answer the mystery question. Your insights always spark such thoughtful conversation. If you enjoyed stepping back into the world of Miss Marple, filled with quiet drama and intricate puzzles, be sure to subscribe for more stories like this. And if you know someone who appreciates vintage crime fiction, British coziness, or clever whodunits, share this story with them. It's always more fun solving mysteries together. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep your eyes open. The smallest clue often hides the biggest secret.